to Leaders in the Arena. My name is Jenny Whitener, and I'm the Executive Director for the Brock Barnes Center for Leadership. Leaders in the Arena is about real stories, hard-earned insights, and practical guidance from leaders doing the work of leadership in the arena. Leaders in the Arena is brought to you by the Brock Barnes Center for Leadership. We are based at Covenant College, and our mission is to equip servant leaders to faithfully build institutions and communities in Christ's work of making all things new. We do that through four major capabilities: our focus on student leadership, our Institute for Innovation and Impact, our executive education capability, and our Wisdom and Insight series, which brings me to our program today and our special guest, Craig Wood, who's retired litigation partner at McGuire Woods and also trustee at Covenant College. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Jenny. Nice to be with you today.
It's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us. You know, I always start off most all of our sessions asking our guests to talk a little bit about their own personal leadership journey. So would you do us that favor, just introduce our listeners a little bit to you and about your journey?
Sure. Thank you. I graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in English with the idea of going to law school, but it was the middle of the 70s with a recession, and I was the oldest of five kids, and so I felt that the best thing for me to do was get a job. What does an English major do? Teaches English. So I went to work as a teacher for 4 years, teaching literature. And in the process of that, both of my parents were educators, and I thought education would be a great alternative career. And so I did all the work for my to get a doctorate in educational administration, finished everything except the dissertation, and became a high school principal and thought that was going to be my path. But I met the love of my life, and she encouraged me to go to law school as we were getting married. And so I did that and found that I really did have a passion for the law, that my early dream of being a lawyer was actually my calling. And it just took me a circuitous path to get to that calling, but I did get there. And as I started to practice law, come out of law school, I went to law school at Washington and Lee University, not far from Charlottesville, and we were living right next to the University of Virginia where Lisa was employed. So we had built a community in Charlottesville with our church and with good friends. And I looked at big law firms all over the Southeast. I interviewed with a lot of firms and decided that I really wanted to just stay in Charlottesville, and joined a smaller firm that ironically, in spite of my efforts to be part of a small firm, my firm grew into 1,200 lawyers by the time I retired. It was one of the 30 largest firms in the country.
I was going to say, probably on the radar for largest in the world.
Yeah, it was big. It is big, and it is thriving. And I'm really proud of what the partners did to grow it to that scale, from a Virginia law firm into an international law firm. So my law practice focused on litigation, and especially because of my background in education law, I wanted to leverage that. And so working with the firm, we created an education law group, which I chaired for a number of years. And that group grew into 100 lawyers. It was almost the size of a good-sized law firm just as an internal group. And we worked with educational institutions all over the country, with major universities, with smaller colleges, with prep schools, even with public schools, helping them with legal compliance, with litigation. And so my practice sort of broke out into about 60 to 70% in-court trial work, and then another 30% advising educational institutions on legal and leadership issues. And so I did that for 40 years until I retired a couple of years ago. And it was a wonderful career, and I had wonderful clients. And it led to a lot of opportunities to be involved in leadership. As you might imagine, people love to have lawyers on nonprofit boards, and most educational institutions are nonprofit. And so I was often asked to be not only the lawyer, but to serve on boards. So I've served as a trustee at Covenant College. I've served as a board member at Surge, an international mission agency in Philadelphia that works on 6 of the 7 continents. Chaired the board for the Education Law Association, which is an international, obviously focuses on education law and policy. And as often happens, you get on a board as a lawyer, and the next thing you find yourself chairing the board. I've chaired all those boards, and interestingly, it's not just me. The last 2 chairs at Covenant College have been lawyers, myself being one of them. 2 of the last 3 chairs at Surge have been lawyers.
How about that?
And the Educational Law Association, they were all lawyers. And so it's been, I have had an opportunity to sit in the client chair as a trustee and a board member, as well as on the advising side, being a lawyer. So that's what the last era of my life has looked like, and it's been very gratifying to have those opportunities. God's been good.
He has been good to you.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful story. And I love the fact, so much of our work at Brock Barnes is really supporting students and their personal leadership growth, as well as working with experienced executives in the workplace. But your story about starting off as an English major and then sort of finding that love of your life and eventually going on to law school, I think it's rewarding to hear that, right? So many of us think that we have to have it all figured out from the beginning. And you were really trusting, right? These opportunities came to you, and you're really leaning into that, leaning into the guidance that you're being given through these opportunities through the Lord. And that's fantastic. What a great story. What a great story. And then also just talking about your leadership broadly, right? So both in the practice and then how that evolved to serving on boards in the nonprofit arena and academic arenas, just broadly, how your leadership opportunities continued to grow as you were really working to give back. And that was one thing I thought that today we could spend some time talking about, because I think often people think of the legal practice as an arena of discourse, right? A lot of potential conflict. Talk to me about, what does servant leadership look like in the legal practice? How do you approach that profession, and what lessons can you help share with us about being a servant leader in law?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that there are many, many opportunities for servant leadership in the law. I think being a servant is a good starting place as we think about what a lawyer is. A lawyer is an agent, not the master. You're working for someone. Your goal is to meet the need of that client. And so you're already in the servant position when you start the client relationship.
It becomes natural. It's really
Right.
the business relationship of your profession.
Yeah. And Martin Luther once said, I love this quote because I think it's so bad. He said, lawyers make bad Christians. And you think about, what he meant by that. And obviously what he meant by that was the demands of law practice and what you have to do as a lawyer can push you into doing things that you ought not to be doing.
Interesting.
But I think he's dead wrong. I've flipped that statement around, and I say Christians make great lawyers for reasons that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go along. So there are temptations in the law and what law practice demands of you that you have to have your eyes wide open about. But law practice especially litigation, the world of courtroom lawyers, where I spent most of my practice, can be. It's a difficult place. It's a harsh place. It's a place of combat and verbal combat, but combat nonetheless. And Scripture calls us to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. Um, so how do you do that in an arena? How do you show others that that's the kind of lawyer you're going to be? And I think that's the big challenge for lawyers for Christian lawyers is to remember what we're called to be ultimately, and not get caught up in the what are the demands of the moment.
Right.
Um, so, the Christian lawyer has to deal with questions like, how do you argue a case in which you really don't believe in your client's position? How do you work through that? How does a Christian lawyer confront a witness who is being hostile and probably untruthful? What if your opposing counsel is aggressive toward you or your client? How do you handle that? What's your response going to be? What is the temptation to be deceptive yourself, even if you know you won't get caught, but it's going to help your client? And I think that's Martin Luther's concern, as the lawyer gives into that and becomes deceptive or deceitful. What do you do when your duty? Lawyers have a duty to maintain the confidentiality of everything the client
Hmm.
tells them. And what happens if that becomes in conflict with the risk of harm to others? How do you work through that? I mean, these are really sticky ethical and professional responsibility questions, and that lawyers struggle with. And they're sort of the kind of hypotheticals that you talk about in law school, and then you get out into law practice and you realize you're dealing with these things every day.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think being a leader as a lawyer is first of all recognizing these traps, these temptations for what they are, and then getting a peace yourself about I'm not going to go down these roads. I'm going to find solutions, and I'm going to default to those solutions every time. I'm not going to get caught uh, uh, trying to figure it out in the moment.
Hmm.
And so and I think again, particularly in the litigation context, when you are in a courtroom and everybody is watching you, they're trying to figure out whether you're credible. A jury is trying to figure out which of these lawyers am I going to believe what they tell
Hmm.
me.
Right.
And so I think that the Christian lawyer really has to be just what I would call brutally honest. You're going to have to be, and you're going to have to tell your client, we're going to tell the truth. We're going to shoot straight. Even when it's hard, we're going to get this jury or this judge to trust us
Mm.
because there is nothing more important in a courtroom than trust.
Interesting.
And so presenting your case, presenting your client, presenting your witnesses in a way that is straightforward, that is credible, that is truthful, that you name the problems in your case and you try to turn those problems into advantages rather than running away from them, so that the jury or the judge sees that you're not trying to be deceitful, that you're saying, I know this looks like a problem, but look at it from this perspective. And
Right.
that, so that you're saying to everybody in the room, we have nothing to hide. We're going to put it all out here, and we're going to tell you why we think our position is the right position. And so I think that was always very important to me. And what really became important over time, I started to realize is that you're typically in front of the same judges all the time. You live in a geographical area for the most part. Some people practice all over the country, but yeah, mostly you get to know federal and state judges pretty well. And once they come to believe in you and know you're telling the truth, they're going to believe you all the time.
Yes.
And lie to them once, and they never will believe you again.
Absolutely.
And I would try to pound that into the heads of the young lawyers that worked with me is never lose the faith of the law of the judge in a courtroom, because once you've lost it, you'll never get it back. And so and,
You know,
and,
and I think these are important lessons for all leaders. I mean, I know that you're coming from a context
yeah,
of the legal profession, but the concepts that you're presenting, that you're addressing complexities, these are tough issues, but you're first, what I hear from you is understand your own value system. Understand if you're a Christian, you're being driven and led by your Christian beliefs. This
right.
concepts of like, am I going to honor truth? Am I going to honor fairness? Am I going to be create these trusting relationships so people know where I'm coming from? Those are principles that all leaders really can embrace. I mean, they sound like they're critically important in the legal profession, but don't you think they're applicable to most every leader in the arena today?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think about when I'm on a board and management comes to me with information about the budget, the cash flow, the personnel, and if you sense that management's not shooting straight with you, the board's going to move into that with probably a fair bit of hostility. And so management has to maintain trust. And then the leadership on the board, when I'm sitting in the chair's position, I'm never going to mislead my board, because once I've done that, I've lost my credibility as a leader.
Right.
And how do you rebuild credibility? It takes a long time.
It
Uh,
does.
and
And
so better to not lose it in the first instance.
right. Guard it feverishly. I mean, just with rigor.
Right.
Because I feel like that your advice here is really around building and honoring trust. And that really goes back to operating with integrity as a
Yeah.
leader. And I think your point, what I'm hearing you say today, is if you break that, if you for some reason falter, it takes a long time to rebuild that trust. And that trust is paramount, especially in your profession, right? But really, I would say it's really paramount trust between leaders and their employees, leaders and their staff, trust in the family, the
Yeah.
leadership role in your family. That fundamental principle is critical for all of us to embrace. And you see the data today, most individuals today don't trust our societal leaders.
Right, right. There's the scripture, let your yes be yes and your no be no, which I think, illustrates the point you're making, that it's not just that you're being honest, but you're being very straightforward. You're not trying to say yes, but, and then explain away the yes or explain away the no. Um, we need to uphold a standard that is higher than the standard that the general culture is pursuing right now.
Mhm.
And so I think Scripture's always told us how to do that. We just don't always pay the attention that we ought to.
Right. Well, that kind of takes me to the next area that I wanted to talk with you about today. And let's go there.
Mhm.
Can you talk a bit more about how Christian faith has shaped your understanding of professional responsibility and ethics and decision making and in leading?
Yes, I'd love to. I was really fortunate, and I would say this is absolutely providential. I don't think these things happen by accident. That when I was in law school, there was a terrific professor at Notre Dame named Tom Shaffer, and Tom was a legal ethicist and a Christian, and he wrote a book called On Being a Christian and a Lawyer in 1981. I was in law school in the early 80s. And then he came to Washington and Lee to be a visiting professor, and he taught legal ethics the year I was taking legal ethics. And so I took my legal ethics course from not just a professor who was a Christian, but a professor who had spent his whole career studying what it means to be a Christian lawyer. And he wrote this amazing book that I keep on my shelf all the time. And I also had at the same time a good friend who was going to University of Virginia Law School, where Tom also taught, Bob Cochran, who went on to become a law professor, studying teaching ethics and studying Christian ethics in the application of the law. And Bob recently published this book the servant leader, the servant lawyer, which is he actually tells a couple of stories from my law practice in the book, and I helped
Yay.
edit the book. It's a wonderful book. So any Christian who is thinking about law who is a lawyer, I would commend Bob's book because he takes all the principles that Tom took. Bob was good friends with Tom Shaffer, and even though he was a generation younger, but he attributes his passion for Christian legal ethics to Tom Shaffer. But his book is very practical and very helpful. And so there are people who have thought about this really deeply and really well, and and who I go to all the time if I'm trying to sort through a moral or ethical dilemma. I want to. It's
Go to those who've studied it.
Yeah. Everybody would wear the little bracelet WWJD. What would Jesus do? Well, I want to know what Tom Shaffer would do because I'm pretty sure Tom Shaffer would do what Jesus would do.
I love it. And what was the name of the book again as you go?
Tom's book is called On Being a Christian and a Lawyer.
Okay.
And then Bob Cochran's book, Robert Cochran Jr., is The Servant Lawyer.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And so both excellent resources for young and old lawyers. But the biblical principles, Jenny, I think that really have motivated me to think really highly about these ethical issues and not just sort of brush them off as, oh, it's a necessary piece of practicing law, but I really need to focus on winning my case. First of all, moral law, which is God's law, is higher than man's law. I think that's an important biblical principle. I mean, over and over again, God's law is the highest law. And so the lawyer has to guard against representing a client and saying, okay, we're looking at this particular statute. Let's just look at the statute, the civil statute or the criminal statute. What does it say? And how can we win the case around it? And you also have to ask yourself, what does God's law require of us as we do this?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to find a way to get those two things together. Because if you're looking at God's law and you forget the statute, you'll lose your case. If you're looking at the statute and don't look at God's law, then you will do something that will ultimately be very unwise for you, for your client, and for society in general. And so both are important, and you have to try to bring them together. So there's that. I think a second principle that's always been important to me, and I often think about C.S. Lewis's example in Mere Christianity, where he talks about the bum in the back of the bus. If we could see that person in heaven, would be the most amazing angel we had ever seen. So the humans are created in God's image, right? And we have to be careful in the law not to reduce our opponent to something that is an enemy and that is subhuman. Mm-hmm. If we can change our view of the opposition to one where this is a person created in God's image, and there is a possibility of appealing to that and getting to a better solution than just a war in a courtroom, if we can appeal to their better self, and if we can appeal to God's law and God's word. I can, if we have time, I can tell you a great story that applies that, where I really saw that work. Remembering who the opposition is still an image carrier of God. And then a third principle that was always essential to me is that Christ is our mediator to God's law and God's righteousness, and we as lawyers should emulate that mediator role. So how can we resolve a dispute by bringing parties together instead of by using our power as lawyers to drive them further apart and make this dispute bigger and bigger and bigger, which might be to our economic advantage, but is doing exactly the opposite of what we're called to as Christian practitioners of law. Um, and then the I think the fourth principle is that anyone who goes to a lawyer, in my experience, kind of walks into the office ready to tell the lawyer, this is what I want. Um, and what the lawyer needs to do is change the perspective of the client to what is it that you need? And those two things can be very different. What
Mhm.
you need is to solve a problem. What you want is a particular outcome. And so, but there might be five possible outcomes. And so, if we are peacemakers, if that's what our role as blessed are the peacemakers, right? Uh,
Right.
if our job is to be a peacemaker, and a lawyer can certainly be a peacemaker as much as they can be a combatant, then the way to be a peacemaker is to help litigants who are in opposition with each other come to peace together by helping each find what they need, and that they can each give the other the thing that they need, even if it wasn't the thing they thought they wanted.
Mhm.
And that the understanding and realization of that principle, I would say more than any other practical thing, drove the way I practice law. It was always about finding solutions that were win-win solutions, and getting the client to stop thinking about, I've got to have what I want.
Right. That's where the
Um,
peacemaker comes into play.
right, right.
Well, the interesting thing about this wisdom that you're sharing here is that it's Christian, it's the biblical guidance that we receive from the Bible that really shapes kind of that ethical behavior. Now, I
Right.
remember, so much today, whether it's around AI or advancements in technology, people are being questioned all the time. Is this ethical? I remember recently I was on a program with a very large innovation center, and they said, well, let's see if our decision-making process is ethical. Let's go over here to these ethic cards and pull an ethics card and see if we're being ethical. And I'm like,
Right.
what's guiding that?
Right.
Like, what are we as a society? We have to determine if we're being ethical by pulling an ethics card and saying, do you pass go? Do you collect
Yeah.
$200? And I hear the strength in your principles to say, look, first and foremost, we go right back to biblical doctrine to say, what are we called to be, right? What is the
Yep.
guidance that we have from the Bible? That gives us our basis for
Right.
ethical behavior, whether you're an attorney or a
Yeah.
CEO, right? Or a student in a dilemma of an internship.
Yeah, and to get past the mindset that those two things are at odds with one another, that somehow doing things just the way the culture generally does them, that doesn't have to be your choice, and you can still be as successful, for in my context. Um, I did very well in the courtroom. My success as a litigator was never compromised by the fact that there were certain principles I was going to bring to bear. They were biblical principles, and I wasn't going to bend them for any client anytime.
Right.
And I
And go
never
back,
really, and I never really thought that bending them would be in my client's best interest. Sometimes I had to convince my client of that.
and go back to your earlier point about the importance of trust and building that trustful credibility. If you have those principles and you stick with them, that becomes that basis for building
Yes.
the trust, right? They're
Yeah.
going hand in glove.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about these habits that you developed over time, sort of the guidance that you would say to help leaders remain grounded and principled in these tough decisions and complexities they're facing today. Any particular insights or wisdom that you would share there?
Yeah, a couple, I think. The things that were really helpful to me, first of all, is you can't do this by yourself. You need to build a network of Christian lawyers who you can just talk to, share stories with. You can talk in general terms about cases without disclosing any confidential information. And to be able to talk about these issues with other people who believe as you do is really helpful. Um, I think we're always stronger together than we are individually, and so that was certainly one. Um, for me, it was staying grounded in my family and in my church. And I say that, somebody would say, well, what does that have to do with being a lawyer? It's because it always reminded me that I should never compromise my legal practice in a way that would ever reflect badly on my church or on my family. That if I do something that is publicly wrong, then
Mhm.
there are a lot more victims of that than just me in my law practice.
Right.
And it was a good reminder that everything I do it has a ripple effect on other people that are very important to me. And ultimately, on Jesus, because the the Christian lawyer who fails will always everybody will be reminding, oh yeah, he said he was a Christian lawyer. She said she was a Christian lawyer and
Right.
yet did this unethical thing. That reflects on Jesus.
Mm.
And we have to be ever mindful of that,
Mm.
even in little ways. I mean, I would think, there's um, most lawyers, at least in the type of practice that I do, bill by the billable hour. And so, and you're writing down your time all day long. It's tedious, but it's necessary if you're going to survive. And there's a huge temptation that lawyers have to pad their billing. Um, and it's talked about all the time. Everybody would acknowledge that it's a temptation. Um, and I just had to be very personally disciplined about saying, Jesus knows if I'm writing down the right time or not. And, and I'm eventually going to stand before him on the day of judgment. And I don't want to have to explain why I thought that making an extra $15 was worth lying about what I was doing for my client.
Wow.
And so that's just an example of the little ways that you remind yourself that nobody's looking,
Mm.
nobody knows what you're doing. You can get away with it. You can slip this piece of bad evidence out of the file before you turn it over to the other side and not let them see it. There's lots of things lawyers can do that they shouldn't do, and and so you have to hold yourself um, to a
Accountable.
higher moral and ethical standard than anybody else would hold you. Or you just ultimately you're not going to be able to live with yourself.
So much of the work that we're doing right now at Brock Barnes, we have a leadership formation model. And the first part of that leadership formation model is establishing your own personal leadership vision.
Yeah,
And here, you're talking about here is like, what are your standards? What are the principles by which you will hold yourself as a leader, whether that's a leader in the legal profession or a leader in some other arena? And based on those principles, how will I hold myself accountable? As Christians, like you said, we're ultimately accountable to Jesus. And we're accountable to our community. I think that's a huge call out there. If you even look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very first
yeah,
element's around shelter and food. What's the
right.
second element? Community. Who
Yeah,
do we surround ourselves with? Who do we have as our own personal circle of trusted advisors? Do they have like principles?
right.
Can they engage with us and guide us as colleagues?
Yeah, that great point, and I totally concur. I think in my own personal experience, and I'll shift a little bit from being a lawyer to being a leader. I was elected by the partnership to be the managing partner in my office. I was leading the education law team, this huge team in the law firm, and then I'm serving as chair of these boards. And so why? Why am I being chosen over and over and over to chair? And I would ask myself that question. And the answer, I believe, is that I always thought that my role was to lead the organization, not through power, but through collaboration, to help people with opposing views about things come together. And my opinion wasn't the important opinion. My job was to help other people get their opinions together so that we could all move forward together. And so people, once people sense that in a leader, that you're not operating from a position of power, you're operating from a position of respect and collaboration, then everybody wants to be a part of that. And they want you there because they don't feel like then they have to break through you, where they have to break through the power leader, or they just bounce off the wall. They have these great ideas and they just get rejected all the time. That to me, that was the sort of the core principle of leadership was I'm leading an organization, and that organization has really great people. And I just need to get those really great people talking to each other and listening to each other and understanding that everybody's perspective is important. And if we do that, then the organization can thrive.
You just described a servant leader.
Right.
You just described a servant leader. I love it. You know, I would love to hear your story that you mentioned earlier. We're getting close on our time. And I do want to give you an opportunity to share some insights around what you would, in terms of the next emerging leaders, the next generation of leaders. Think about those who are new in their journey as leaders. What advice or words of wisdom would you share with them today as we begin to wrap up?
Yeah. First of all, identify a mentor who is somebody that you really respect, and respect both in their leadership ability and in their Christian walk. I have seen young people with great ability go on to do wonderful things, and they would attribute it to their mentor. And so I think mentorship is a powerful tool, and you should seek that out. Don't wait for it to happen. Identify somebody and just go and ask. Would you have lunch with me once a month? So I think there's that. I think there's build a community of like-minded people is really important. Um, uh, I think those are probably the two things that I found most helpful was mentorship and like-minded fellow journeymen.
Right. And I think, as you said, I think oftentimes we can get in the place of a victim, like nobody's offered to be my mentor. And I think your point is a good one. Ask someone.
Yeah.
Don't wait. It's a critical capability or role to have in your life as you're growing. And if you see a great leader, ask them if they'll be your mentor. You might have to be respectful of their time a little bit, especially if they're really busy. But just ask. That's the fastest way to know is to not ask, right?
Right.
And then building that sense of community.
And you'll be surprised. They'll be honored that you asked them.
Yeah, right. So you might have to, if they say no, then you go to number two. But
yeah, that's
absolutely.
Right. There's somebody out there that can help you, and don't do this by yourself.
Right. Well, Craig, thank you so much for joining us today on Leaders in the Arena. It's been an amazing session. I've learned a lot. I want to make sure that maybe at the end of today's program, we'll take those two books that you've talked about, and I'll make sure that our listeners have a chance to get those titles if they'd like to pick those up, the ones that you gave us guidance on. Right. So as we close today, I want to ask our listeners also to think about a lesson that you've learned today. I've heard several from Craig, but think about the lessons you may have learned today and what practical step you'll take in applying it to your own leadership. To hear more conversations on servant leadership, stay connected to the Brock Barnes Center for Leadership. You can subscribe, or it's hard to say that, to subscribe to our newsletter. Just go to brockbarnes.covenant.edu, and it's easy to jump in there and subscribe. And if you'd like to continue to give towards our efforts to help fund our ongoing program, you can do that also just by clicking the Give button on our website. So, Craig, thank you so much for being here today. And I know I'll see you soon at Covenant College when you come in for the board meeting.
Good. Look forward to it, Jenny. Thank you for having me.
May God bless you and your continued leadership in many, many ways, Craig. Thank you.